Hi, I'm Mike Duggan. I've been teaching restorative dentistry for over 32 years now and to over 6,000 dentists. This video shows how I do it. Real-time, mannequin-based, hands-on, point of view, and patient real. If you are a pre-dental student, an aspiring teacher, an international dentist, join me at Duggan Oral Design, dugganoraldesign.com. Yeah, I hope they go back after COVID is over or becomes endemic. Because as I said before, a patient-based exam is way better
It's way easier.
to learn. No,
No.
no, it's way better to learn more dentistry while you're preparing for the exam. I prepared 5,000 people to take clinical exams, and they learned a lot while they were preparing for the exam. They learned 3 times more about dentistry than a candidate preparing for a typodont exam. 3 times more they learned. So, I was always in favor of whatever helps the dentist learn more dentistry. The typodont exam doesn't do it. And it makes a lot of people happy,
Exactly.
but, not when you realize that you just didn't learn very much. Okay? So again, taking the skills that we're learning here on a mannequin and then applying those to a patient, that's where it really gets fun. Okay? Now, we treat the mannequin as much as we can like a patient. But yeah, there's nothing quite as nice as cutting real enamel and real dent and saliva and gingiva and all those kinds of things. Then it really starts to get fun. Yeah, and working with the rubber dam on, you're taking the clinical exam on a patient and you work with rubber dam on. Now, they have in many places made you put a rubber dam on a typodont for a typodont exam, but putting a rubber dam on a typodont is a whole different thing from putting it on a patient. It's much easier on a patient. But you don't know that if you've only put it on a typodont. Okay? And it's much easier to put a rubber dam on a typodont if you have an assistant that knows how to do it, or knows how to put it on a patient or anything. If you have an assistant that knows how to help you put a rubber dam on, then it's easy.
Exactly.
It takes a minute to put a rubber dam on a patient when you have a well-trained assistant. And then it saves you 10 minutes in your work.
Yes, ma'am.
So wait a minute, you invest 1 minute and it saves you 10 minutes. Well, that's a net savings of 9 minutes. How much do you make per hour? And then figure out, okay, 9 minutes savings. Okay, you just put a lot more money in your pocket because you use a rubber dam.
That's true, Doc.
People don't get that. Because they were forced to a rubber dam in patients in the dental school, and most people don't have the manual dexterity to do it by themselves, and they didn't have a friend help them, so they both learned how to do a four-handed rubber dam installation in a patient. So they hated putting rubber dams on in patients in dental school, so once they got out of dental school, everybody just says, okay, I'm never going to do that again. Okay, I likened that to, when you're young, I don't know what time you guys, what age you were when you left home, but I was 18 when I left home, left my parents. And when I left home and went to school, the first thing I said was, I'm never going to eat another Brussels sprout. Okay, because my mother did a horrible, she was a good cook, but she did a horrible job cooking Brussels sprouts. They were awful, just disgusting. So I said, I'm never going to eat another Brussels sprout. It took me 10 years before I discovered how wonderful Brussels sprouts are when they're cooked well. But most dentists, when they leave dental school, they say, oh, I'm never going to put in a rubber dam. It's a childish reaction. And, some of them, they might discover, okay, now 10 years later, 20 years later, well, if I put a rubber dam in, I'll make more money. Oh, why didn't I know that from the beginning? So anyway, there's a lot of things that come up as you go along, but patient-based exams are a huge benefit. Again, I see that as a teacher to help people prepare for a patient-based exam. The candidates usually generally tend to think, okay, it's easier if they do it on a typodont, but being easier is one thing. Learning more that's going to help you in your practice, that's another thing. So take the advantage to learn as much as you can. Okay, I was talking to somebody earlier, and there's something that I meant to mention yet,
Yes.
earlier. Huh?
What if we damage the adjacent tooth?
Damage to the adjacent tooth. Thank you very much. Okay, so the question is, what if you damage the adjacent tooth? Let's think about it practically. Okay, let's think about it as far as the patient's concerned. Okay, so again, we're talking clinical dentistry. So how you're graded on a typodont should depend, ideally it would depend on what the clinical situation would be. Okay, because that's what we're trying to learn. We're trying to learn how to do dentistry clinically on a patient. So if we damage the adjacent tooth on a patient, okay, is any amount of damage a horrible thing? Or can we do some damage and it's not so horrible? Or what are your thoughts on that? Everybody thinks, oh, if I just touch the adjacent tooth on a typodont, I'm dead. Okay, that's not the way it is. Not in a patient. You can do a little damage on the adjacent tooth, you can flatten out the contact or whatever, and yeah, the way I grade is if I know that I could recontour the adjacent tooth without losing too much enamel, do a little enameloplasty around, get the contour of the enamel back again so I get a good form for the contact. The restoration on the adjacent tooth doesn't have to lean out too far and have a bad lever arm when it comes to making that contact again. Then that's not necessarily something that will shorten the lifetime of the restoration. But if you do such damage on the adjacent tooth that you have to do a root canal, that's a different thing. If you have to do a restoration on the adjacent tooth, that's a different thing. If you can't recontour the adjacent tooth and get the contours looking natural without cutting away too much enamel or causing the adjacent restoration to be extending out too far, that's a different thing. So those are, again, just practical considerations clinically. So if you have questions about anything having to do with, what's pass and what's fail, again, think about the clinical consequences. And if you can figure out, okay, that's going to be a real problem, then it fails. Or you say, okay, that's something that, okay, it's not right, but it should not fail the restoration. Okay, but again, you got to be thinking very mechanically. You got to be thinking in terms of the design. You got to be thinking in terms of 3 dimensions. Okay, so a little bit of damage is okay. Now, here's the problem. So the way I grade you is if you've damaged the adjacent tooth, I look at it and say, okay, could I recontour the adjacent tooth and have everything come out successfully? If so, then I won't fail you for that mistake. But here's the thing is, if you damage the adjacent tooth because you're looking the wrong direction, for example, or something on that order, if you're careless enough so you damage the adjacent tooth, you probably yourself don't have the skill to fix it. Okay? It's very difficult to recontour the adjacent tooth without damaging the margins of your prep, especially if your prep, the clearances aren't very much. So very difficult to recontour the adjacent tooth without damaging your prep. If you had the skill to recontour the adjacent tooth without damaging your prep, then you have the skill not to damage the adjacent tooth in the first place. Get it?
Doctor, I have one more question.
Okay.
So if it's like just a minor, we just rub it, with the burr. So is there any way, like if it's not that much, can we rub like composite strips on it to even it out, or?
Well, that's why I was calling recontouring.
Recontouring.
So when I say recontouring, that's what I'm talking about.
That's what-
I'm not necessarily talking about strips. Okay. You're not going to be able to do anything with composite finishing strips.
Yes, sir.
That's not going to do anything at all. So using a burr, a appropriate selected burr, tomorrow we'll find out a burr that would work for that.
Yes.
We'll use it for a different purpose. If you use diamond strips,
Diamond strips? Yes, sir.
okay, don't use them.
No.
Okay.
It can rub off more.
Well, they're very abrasive
Yes, sir.
and they leave a very irregular surface. And so I've seen cases where orthodontists have stripped the proximal contact so they can move teeth back into the arch. and that flat surface that they're making gets decay in the middle of it, right in the middle of the contact, which is the only time you ever get decay in the middle of a contact. So yeah, recontouring with a burr, and getting the sharp edges off and getting the flatness off and really smoothing it out. Again, that takes some skill. Okay, and if you have that skill, you wouldn't have hit the adjacent tooth in the first place. I mean, imagine you're trying to recontour it. You've got to be looking in exactly the right direction in every little area that you're smoothing, so that you don't hit the margins of your prep. And if you know enough to look in all those different directions, so when you're doing the box, you would be looking in the right directions, then you wouldn't be hitting the adjacent tooth. Okay, so those are things that we won't be working on fixing the adjacent teeth, but we'll certainly be working on looking in the right directions. So again, once you get skillful with your class 2 preps, you don't have to worry about hitting the adjacent teeth. So you don't have to worry about fixing them or anything. Okay, ready for the lower arch? Okay, about time. So we got a lower first molar over here, 19, and where's the decay? So we're going to have decay in the proximal surface, just like we've seen before. Decay in the pits, along the central groove, out the facial groove over here, lingual groove over here, distal groove over here, distal buccal groove. So that would be a typical kind of decay pattern. You've seen lots of lower molars that have lots of decalcification and decay in the grooves. So we're going to extend into each of these grooves for purposes of removing the decay, but also, as I said before, if we have a margin that's crossed by a groove, the groove makes the wall short, so we extend into the groove to keep the wall taller. So we get up to 1.5 millimeters. Now we have triangular ridges coming down, 5 different triangular ridges coming down into the central groove area of this tooth. These 5 triangular ridges come down, they're pretty tall, aren't they? So where these triangular ridges come down, when we do our prep, in that area, that wall tends to be pretty tall, but if we cut too far into that triangular ridge, it gets really tall, fast. So we're going to try to preserve the triangular ridges when we're doing this in each of these areas, so the walls don't get too tall. But we also have to make sure that we extend into the grooves so the walls don't get too short. So the cool thing is, on this final outline that we're going to do, all the walls are going to be the same height. Also, the lower arch, as you know, there's a curve of Wilson. Remember Wilson? So the occlusal surfaces tend to be tilted toward the lingual curve of Wilson, right? Not Spee, but Wilson. Okay, so, and then also inside the tooth, where the pulp chamber is, the pulp horns tend to be higher on the facial and lingual. So they tend to follow kind of that same angulation as the curve of Wilson. As we do the prep, we want to make sure we keep the pulpal floor a little bit sloping deeper on the lingual, because if we had the pulpal floor more horizontal, we might threaten the facial pulp horn. So in order to make the prep leaning lingually, make the pulpal floor deeper on the lingual, all we have to do is point the burr perpendicular to the line between the cusps and use the burr at that angle, so lean the burr lingually a little bit. And the pulpal floor will naturally be tipped lingually a little bit, like the curve of Wilson, and then we're protecting the facial pulp horn. So when I say lean the burr lingually, that's what I mean. If you're not sure what it means to lean the burr lingually, don't worry about it. Just do whatever you need to do to protect the facial pulp horn. That's the bottom line. So this is vertical. I'm leaning the burr lingually. You could call it leaning the burr buccally. I don't care, as long as you do it this way. All right, you can say I'm leaning the burr toward Las Vegas. Cool, okay? As long as we're protecting the facial pulp horn. Okay, so as I do this occlusal outline, I'm going to follow the central groove. I'm going to preserve the triangular ridges. I'm going to cut into each of the developmental grooves in each of those 4 areas. I want to see how tall the walls are while I'm doing it. So again, as I do the occlusal outline, what do I need to see? Huh?
The wall.
Okay, so the walls of the occlusal outline, I want to make sure I see that they're 1.5 millimeters tall. Okay, what else do I need to see?
The width.
The width of the isthmus, okay. I need to see that.
Convergence.
Well, the vertical angle is important. So I need to see that I'm leaning the burr lingually. And I keep it leaning lingually for the entire occlusal part of the prep. Don't be, doing this. And what else do I need to see?
Central group.
What about it?
We need to see that we follow it lingually all through the central group.
I need to see the isthmus is right on top of the central groove. Okay, so the 4 things I need to see. Okay, I need to see the angulation. I need to see the position this way. I need to see the height of these walls. And I need to see the basic width of the isthmus. Okay? So, what's my next question?
From where to see.
How am I going to see those things? Can I see all those things at one time? Sure?
I mean,
I think
usually we can.
Oh, we can't look occlusally ever.
Oh yeah. No.
Right?
Uh,
So the question then is, which way do I look so I can see as much of that as possible?
9 o'clock.
Huh?
9 o'clock usually.
Say again?
So 9 o'clock, 9 or 10 o'clock position, whatever.
Well, that's not the direction I'm looking. That's where I have my chair. Okay, maybe I'll have the chair there, maybe I won't.
Parallel.
And
Parallel to what?
parallel to the prepared
to
to
the central group.
Parallel to the central groove. Yeah. So will that allow me to see everything? If I'm looking along the central groove, can I see this angle?
We can.
Sure. Can I see this position?
Yes.
We can.
Sure. Can I see the width of the isthmus? Sure. Can I see the height of the walls? Sure. Oh, that's good news. So all I have to do is look along the central groove. And I can see everything I need to as far as the isthmus and so forth. Now, it's a little bit tricky when it comes to extending into the grooves. You see these grooves go facially and lingually, so I might sort of cheat and look around the corner a little bit and mark where those grooves are, especially this one and this one and this one. And then come back and I can cut into each of those grooves, but I want to extend into each of those grooves. This one's pretty easy. The distal groove is pretty easy because when I'm looking along the arch, when I'm looking parallel to the central groove from the mesial side, it's pretty much right there. So I see exactly where it is. On some typodonts, there's an extra pit over here. We need to make sure we extend and include that pit. You can see when you're looking along the arch, you can see there's cuts coming down like that. There's a groove right there. There's a pit over there. Just bang right into it. Don't miss it. Okay? A lot of times people totally miss that groove. It's right in front of you. When you're looking from the mesial, it's right in front of you. People end up going like this. I see that a lot. Now, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. All right? You're extending into a groove, but it's a triangular ridge. That's not a groove. That's a ridge. That makes no sense whatsoever, right? So when you do that, make sure you tell yourself, okay, what I just did makes no sense. Okay? And then don't do it again. Again, if you're looking in the right direction and knowing that you're supposed to extend into each of those grooves and why we extend into each of those grooves, we're not just trying to make a particular shape. Okay? We're extending into each of those grooves for a particular reason. There's decay there, and we get short walls, so we're going to get taller walls and get rid of the decay. Now, if you're doing a second molar over here, and you make this shape on the second molar, that's a problem. There are no grooves like that. It's a different anatomy. It's going to be a different shape prep. Okay, so don't forget to keep that in mind. We're doing this anatomy specifically because that's the shape of the tooth. That's the groove structure of that particular tooth. Okay, so now how am I going to look along the arch? Okay, well, we've been sitting behind the patient this way to work on the upper arch. That was pretty easy. We could do everything sitting in the 12 o'clock position. If I want to look along the arch from this direction, I better move around like this. Okay, so now I'm sitting in the maybe 8 o'clock chair position. Turn the patient toward me so I can have a conversation with them. I'm looking right along the arch this way and right along the arch over here. I can see where I am, I can see the angle, I can see the heights of the walls and so forth. So looking along the arch is very easy to do as long as you get your chair in the right position. Turn the patient's head a little bit so you're looking along the arch. Make sure you are before you do anything. Okay, now once we finish this part, then we cut, as always, to the middle of the contact, right next to the adjacent tooth, and then nip out facially, find their facial margin, come in 90 degrees, the way we always do, come in far enough, the way we always do, make a smooth curve to join the isthmus, do the same thing over here. So nothing's new about this prep, nothing's different about this prep than anything that we've been doing so far. And then what do we do when we go gingivally? We drill a hole, we cut away from this side, we drill a hole over here, cut away from this side, and we extend, gingivally repeating those 7 steps until we get gingival clearance. So again, nothing new. Gingival floor width, just like we talked about before. Use the hand instruments. Again, when we use the hand instruments, we have to use the mirror, always, upper arch, lower arch. So use a mirror so you're looking down the wall, so you know the instrument's perpendicular to the surface. When you trim off the hooks, sharpen the internal line angles, place retainer grooves, angle the gingival floor. Then we're done. Now, the question comes up, okay, how do I look? How do I position myself so I can see what I need to when I'm working in the box? So when we're working in the box, we always look parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. Sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay, how do I do that? Now on number 30 over here, if I'm sitting in my chair in the 9 o'clock chair position, the patient's feet are over there. This is it. I'm looking parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. So I can see everything I need to. Now, as I do the occlusal outline, it's trial and error. So I'm nipping a little bit toward the lingual, and then I have to turn my head this way and use the mirror to see if I've got enough clearance. Nip a little bit more by direct vision, check in the mirror to see if I've got the clearance. Once I get the clearance, cut straight in, use the mirror like this, and check to see if I have the right angle. Change the angle a little bit. Again, I'm changing my position to see if I have the right angle. Okay? Same thing to get the clearance in the facial, the exit angle in the facial, get the length of the walls, facial and lingually, then make the nice smooth curve here. Then when I go gingivally, again, I'm looking parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle, no problems. Okay? But it's a lot more work. Okay? I'm cutting a little bit, I'm going like this. And on the upper arch, it was really easy. We cut a little bit, check the clearance, change it, check the angle, cut the angle, check the angle, cut the angle, check the angle, just moving the mirror around. Here we're moving all around from different positions so we can really see what we're doing. What about the lower left on 19? I have to be looking parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. Well, there it is. How am I going to look that direction?
Bigger.
If I did it from here, I'd have to flip the patient over on their belly practically, wouldn't I? Okay? And we're not going to use the mirror on the lower arch. We can't get the angulation. By the way, when you drive, you use a mirror, right? Okay, not the little dental mirror. But there's a mirror inside the car, the rear view mirror. You look in the mirror and the car's behind you. Move in predictable ways. If the car behind you moves to the left, the image in the mirror moves to the left. Car behind you moves to the right, the image in the mirror moves to the right. That's why we can drive, because it's expected, it's predictable, it makes sense. Our brain doesn't have to adapt to anything that is confusing to us. Okay? So the geometry of the mirror use in the car is the same as we're going to do on the patient. Okay? So we try to use the mirror on the other side, work back toward ourselves, so it's the same geometry we have in the car. And then the burr moves in the way that we think it's going to move. And the image in the mirror moves the way we expect to. Now, if we don't get those angles, then the image of the burr moves in a way that we don't expect. And so on the lower arch, we can't get those angles. That's why we end up using direct vision for most of the time on the lower arch. Okay? But again, we use direct vision to cut, and then we use the mirror to see how we did. Okay? Now on the lower left, I'm going to sit behind the patient, turn the patient to the right, lean over and look this way. Now I'm looking parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. But to see what I did, I'm going to nip a little bit out facially, and then I have to come around like this to use the mirror and see how much clearance I get. I'm going to adjust the angles, and every time I do it a little bit, I'm going to have to come around here to check the angle. So a lot more movement. Okay, now, if you're focusing pretty close, if you're working 10 or 12 inches away, you don't have to move very much. Just tilt your body a little bit. What if you're working out at 18 inches? Okay, then you have to come all the way over here, then all the way back over here, a little more, then all the way over here. When you're working farther away from the patient, then you have a lot more movement to do with your chair and your body between the position you are for cutting and the position you are for checking. So that's one of the things we keep in mind, especially when we're starting to use loops. So I haven't talked about loops yet. It's a good time to talk about loops. Okay, so you notice my loops, I'm working at about 11 inches, something like that. So anywhere between 10 and 12 inches is a good length. You know, I can lean over and I can work on the lower arch without having to move too much. The patient's not way down here, they're up here. Got my arms against my body, I've got everything stabilized a lot more. And again, there's not much moving that I have to do in order to use the mirror on the lower arch. But if you're way down here, as I think you were saying, that, you know, once you get down here, your neck starts to get sore because you're looking downward. But if you bring the patient up, then your neck straightens. So if you have the patient far away, if you have a long working distance, the patient's down here, it keeps your back vertical, but your neck's bent. So bring the patient up this way, and now we can focus closer, and our neck's straighter. We have more stability, and we don't have to move as much when we're working in the lower arch. Okay, all big advantages. Sales reps aren't going to talk to you about that. So here, we're going to learn about that. Okay, and so what I want you to do is be experimenting with different sets of loops. We got a lot of loops for you to try. Most of them are either short or regular working distances, but how that translates into a distance for you depends upon your eyes. So you need to find some loops, adjust the distance between the two lenses so they match your interpupillary distance. You should just see one circle when you're looking through with both eyes. And then you should be very comfortable, very fast, working with loops. But again, if they're too far away, it makes life really miserable. Now, I think that the sales reps in most companies, they're, excuse me, they're trained to teach you, to explain to you why you want loops that focus far away. Mostly they talk about ergonomics. Ergonomics is basically, how vertical is your back, okay? They don't talk about the vertical, about the ergonomics of the neck. But if they can get you to buy loops that are far away, that's great for them, because if something's far away, it's small, right? If I were to walk to the door, I'd get smaller and smaller as I get closer to the door, as far as you can tell. So the farther you are away, the farther you work, the farther is your working distance with loops, the smaller things get. And the whole point of loops is to see more. Okay? Okay, so if you're working too far away, then you have to have a very high magnification in order to see more. Because it's really small. So the magnification you need if you're working at like 16 or 18 inches is going to have to be like 5 power in order for you to see enough to really get the details that you need to see in order to determine whether the restoration can be done so it's going to last its expected lifetime. So if you're having to have 5 power loops, well, cheap loops only go up to about 3.5 maximum. So for 5 power loops, you have to spend a lot more money to get loops. And for the sales reps, that's a good thing, right? So instead of spending $500 for a pair of loops, you're spending $2,500. That's great, right? Not so good for you,
But the same thing.
great for them. So if you can get loops for $500 or $400, even $300 that work close enough, so you bring the patient up this way, your back is straight, your neck is straight, you see more, you've got everything nice and stable, you don't have to move so much, and you only spent $500, that's great. But I've had students come in that have got loops that are like 18 inches away, and they're out there like this working. But man, that's tough. But if you spent $3,000 on a pair of loops like that, you're going to suffer because you don't want to have the realization that you wasted all that money. You don't want to have the realization that somebody suckered you into buying a lot more money, spending a lot more money than you really needed to. As a dental student, when you guys become dental students, they're going to give you a really big credit card. Okay? So they're expecting that you're going to spend $300,000 in 1 year in school. So they'll give you a credit card for, effectively, an account with a limit of $300,000. Okay? That's cool. So spending, $3,000 or $4,000 on a pair of loops seems insignificant compared to $300,000. But don't forget, if you buy a $3,000 pair of loops and you have to start paying on it and the interest is accumulating, by the time you actually pay it off with everything else, you've spent $5,000 on a pair of loops. Okay, that's ridiculous. So, yeah, you can get a good pair of Galilean loops, not prism loops like what I have. With the Galilean loops, you don't have to have the power that I use, and get a working distance that's 10 to 12 inches, 2.5 power, 3 power is plenty good enough. You don't have to spend a ton of money, and then you'll be doing fine. But you need to learn what works well for you. Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
How do we do the outline for first molar if it's a DO?
Excellent question. Okay, that's a very unusual prep to do during an exam, but I'm glad you mentioned that. So, we're going to come through here, cut to the middle of the contact, find the facial margin, come in at a 90-degree angle, make a smooth curve to join the isthmus, come out from the lingual margin, come in 90 degrees, make a smooth curve to join the isthmus, make an axial wall like this. It's going to be very curved because, of course, the distal cusp is very curved. But note that between the distal buccal groove here and the facial margin of the prep on the occlusal surface, there's a little bit of unsupported enamel. Okay? So if we have a prep like this and we have a groove outside the prep, then the enamel here, the enamel rods are perpendicular to the surface, so they're going to be a little bit undermined. If you do the prep like that, you have that little edge there, then what's going to happen is you can take an explorer and just break it off. So that's undermined enamel on the occlusal surface. So that's a little bit different from what we've talked about before, but it's worth paying attention to. That's why they generally will not ask the DO on an exam. Because if you had that, you'd have to figure out what to do. So you'd have to ask them, do you want me to leave the undermined enamel on the occlusal surface at the distal buccal groove? Or would you like me to remove it with enameloplasty? Or would you like us to overextend to include the groove in the prep? Now, that's a very impressive thing to ask during an exam, isn't it? Nobody else has even got a remote idea that that could be an issue. But you've got it figured out. And you ask that question, and they go, "Oh, okay, okay, just ignore it." He's probably whoever's the faculty member is that's running the exam didn't think of it either. Every once in a while, in fact, this goes back a long ways. Back in the 90s, I was training some students to do an exam, and they gave a lower molar DO, and one of my students heard the examiners having a conversation. And the conversation went something like this: why did they assign the DO? What are we going to do about that distal buccal groove? How are we going to grade that? Okay? So, but occasionally, people assign that without thinking that through. Well, then you ask the question as to how you want to handle that. Clinically, we've got to be able to handle that. Do a little enamelplasty, that would be the simplest thing to do. So you could ask, would you like me to do a little enamelplasty and get rid of that undermined enamel right there? And they might say, sure, I want to do that. Or they might say, just don't worry about it. But it's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up.